This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Nuestra Familia, Tangled Loyalty. Everything described in this episode of Paradigm Profiles was derived from police reports, court transcripts, and personal accounts. It is concise, thoroughly accurate, and is all part of public record. On June 11, 2004, sometime around 5:30 in the early morning hours, I was laying on a futon in a small room that I had converted into a makeshift office. At the time, I was living on the east side of San Jose with my wife Vicky in a 3-bedroom house at 2820 Beecher Court. I had all my computer equipment in this office along with some small Century banks that I used to store money, weapons, and sometimes the regiment's methamphetamine supply in. I had been up late that night, well after 3 a.m., going through a disc that had been smuggled out of a federal courthouse in Oakland, California during the Operation Black Widow investigation. We had acquired the disc through a corrupted court clerk who passed it off to one of the criminal defense attorneys who was representing one of the principal defendants in the case. From there, the defense attorney, who was also considered to be a close ally, then passed it off to one of the wives of an NF general so that it could then be passed on to me. Upon receiving the disc that contained 1,956 pages of court-sealed documents, a short message was also facilitated in the form of a directive. Go through every document and every exhibit on this disc and take notes of everything in it that was disseminated about you. It contains the identity of rats, active informants who are working with law enforcement on the streets, FBI 402s, SSU memorandums, debriefing reports, and statements being made by rats who are providing information in Operation Black Widow. I was also instructed to make copies of the disc and to make sure that BJ from Watsonville and Baki and Salinas both got copies. I couldn't believe the vast amount of information that this disc contained or some of the things I was reading. Some of it was actually heartbreaking as I was finding out for the first time that people like Louis Big Roach Roche from San Francisco, a homeboy of mine who I had grown up with, was providing information about me to the FBI. Furthermore, he had worn a wire to a meeting he had attended at my house with another homeboy they called Mexican Mike from Oakland. Big Roach was someone I had an enormous amount of respect for, and it was literally numbing knowing that he was trying to set me up the way he did. I sat there that night in front of my computer making notations on a white piece of paper, writing down other tidbits of information that I'd occasionally run across. Whenever I'd see something about anyone who was assigned to my regiment, I'd write it down so I could tell them about it the following day. Our objective from that point was to then locate these informants and to start the usual business of exterminating as many as we could. Sometime around 3 a.m., I stood up and called it a night. I had went through so much material that I was beginning to get cross-eyed. When I turned off my computer, I went through all the notes I had written real quick to absorb the gravity one more time of what I had just learned that night. It was a lot to digest. It wasn't the fact that a lot of the information was catastrophic and extremely detrimental to the organization, but it was also the level of informants within the organization that became so distressing. Things were about to get real messy, and some of the blunders that were coming back to hurt us could have actually been avoided. After looking over my written notes one last time, I recounted the stacks of money that I had in neat piles of thousands so that I'd have it ready when my connect, Don Julio, came by to get it early the next morning. There was a total of 35 grand. Earlier that day, my second in command, Arthur Pony Hernandez, had dropped the money off after making his rounds to all the regimental members and had collected all the money they had from selling the regiment's dope. Pony was only one of a very select few that I ever allowed to come by my crib. This was a practice that I had followed religiously for years, as I never made a habit out of letting too many people come to the spot where I laid my head. Not only that, but when you were in the business of self-enterprise or becoming a freelance entrepreneur, you learned expeditiously that cutting down on foot traffic minimized your chances of getting snitched on. The less people that knew what was going on, the better. Coincidentally, on this same night, I had broken my own policy. And I did it despite the fact that I had a bad feeling about it in the pit of my stomach. There was an individual named Jose Largo Garcia from Gilroy who wasn't a member of my regiment, but he was considered a close associate. I had done time with him in San Quentin, and he was also someone I had known for years. I started fronting this individual ounces of crystal, and he inevitably ended up getting himself into debt with me. And I knew he was fucking with it because all the signs were there. He just had that look about him. He always had cracked lips, a dry ass mouth, and he started doing that crazy twitch thing that meth heads are known for when they go on 3 and 4 day runs. That and that other weird thing them cats do when they grind their teeth. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I knew Largo was digging himself into a deep hole because he was falling deeper and deeper into debt. It got to the point where I started giving him deadlines. In fact, that same week, I had told him that if he didn't come up with the entire amount of money that he owed, that I was going to take a clean ass step ride that he owned and an Indian Scout motorcycle that he had built when he was working for Indian Motorcycles. This had him stressed out, and I knew it was something that he was worried about. At any rate, he called me that same night and pleaded with me to let him come by to pick up another ounce so that he could make the money back. Before this, I never let him come to my house, but I didn't feel like going back out that night, so I broke my own policy and just let him come by. Now, I'd never try to put a jacket on anybody because I know how fucked up it is, but after everything was said and done that night, Largo was somebody I had become deeply suspicious about. You guys tell me what you think. You'll understand after I tell you what happened next. So after I laid down, I was out probably within 5 minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I was out. Unfortunately, this would be the last time in a decade that I'd ever had the luxury of sleeping in my own bed or the luxury of falling asleep in my own bed. There's no way I possibly could have known this, but I was about to find out. So after falling into a deep sleep for about 2 hours, I was woken up by what sounded like someone kicking my front door. When I jumped up, I literally felt the whole house vibrating under my feet, and I could hear the windows rattling. As I made my way down the small entryway into the living room, I knew that there could only be one of a few possibilities that might be happening. Either someone was stupid enough to try to rob me, the NF generals had sent a few torpedoes to whack me, or the most likely scenario, someone had set me up and snitched on me with regards to the drugs and weapons I had stashed in the house. There was no reason that would have justified leadership to have me hit, as I was in good standings, but I never took anything for granted when it came to NF politics. I knew all too well that the game was dirty and that it was turning cutthroat. As far as the possibility of it being law enforcement, this was the one scenario that I was leaning more towards because it would have only taken one shady individual to bring me down. Someone with something to lose or someone with an agenda to get me out the way. But I had only lived in San Jose for less than a year, and I just never thought it could happen that fast. Not with all the extra security caveats I was taking. When I finally made my way to the living room and the front door became visible, I could see that the whole area around the locking mechanism was smashing in and that there were pieces of the door all over my living room floor. One thing was definitely clear. Whatever or whoever it was that stood on the opposite side of that door was coming in, and I stood there ready to face it. If it was an NF hit squad, then I was only seconds away from facing my would-be assassins and a certain imminent death. If it was someone bold enough to rob me, then my fate probably would have been the same. My only real concern at that point was to do whatever I could to protect my wife Vicky, who was still asleep in the bedroom. Unfortunately, I stood there at the door, unarmed and in no position to defend myself other than with my bare hands. My mind told me to grab a weapon, to grab a knife from the kitchen, or to try to dispose of the drugs stashed in the house. But my legs wouldn't move, and the element of surprise had caught me completely off guard. When the door finally did swing open, this is when I got my first look at the 10 to 15 law enforcement officers who were wearing full tactical gear, armed with assault weapons. I think they were just as surprised to see me standing there. Instead of just charging straight in, there was a brief pause before they all started yelling, "Get on the fucking ground, get down." Maybe I was in a state of shock myself because I just stood there facing them, not really sure what to do, and I wasn't complying. I must have looked pretty foolish standing there defying their verbal commands without a weapon against 15 members of San Jose's SWAT team. Along with SWAT, there were other agencies that were also part of this operation. B&E, Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, San Jose PD, Santa Clara PD, CHP, California Highway Patrol, and the primary agency that spearheaded this investigation, SCCSET, or Santa Clara County Specialized Enforcement Team. As I stood there refusing to comply and ignoring their commands to get on the ground, the SWAT officers close to the door began firing a succession of flash grenades, all of which hit me in the legs. I don't remember exactly how many they fired, but it had to be somewhere around 5 or 6 because they fucked my legs up. Honestly though, my adrenaline was pumping so much, I really didn't even feel it until later. When I finally made my way to the front door, I was quickly grabbed, yanked outside, and wrestled to the ground. Then they handcuffed me and walked me back inside my living room where they sat me on my couch. Once I was secured, they walked to the back bedroom where my girl was still at and brought her out to the living room with me. At this point, we sat on the couch while they started searching the whole house. In the picture below, you can see us sitting on the couch handcuffed with our backs to the camera. You can just barely make out one of the female officers on the left who was sitting there watching us. Now, I'm obviously not going to be able to cover everything here that I covered in my book, but what I'm going to focus more on here is what happened once I hit the county jail and some of the details that I didn't mention in my book. I'm also going to focus more on some of the things that happened that would result in me falling into bad standings. So one of the things that I had always promised Vicky is that I would never allow her to get caught up in any of my legal issues that stemmed from the type of lifestyle I was living. I always assured her that I'd never let that happen, and this was something that was starting to weigh on me. As the search commenced and they began finding dope, weapons, and dope, and weapons, and more dope, and more weapons, I called out to one of the B&E sergeants and told him, "Hey man, anything you guys find in this house, I'll own up to it and I'll fess up to it right now. My girl don't have shit to do with nothing going on here, just let her go." He told me, "We don't have nothing to do with that part of it. We're just here to do the breach and to execute the search. The primary agency that's in charge of this investigation should be here in the next few minutes." I knew I was in a bad situation and that I was looking at a live case. I was a 3-striker and my priors alone were going to wash me up. But even though I knew I was basically done, I was still trying to give my girl some of the assurance that I knew she needed. She was already getting emotional and she was already telling me all the things that were making me feel like shit. She said, "You promised me you'd never get taken away from me. You told me you'd never leave me. What am I gonna do now, Boxer?" No doubt I felt like shit and there wasn't nothing I could really say. But I had to do and say what I could to make her feel like there was still some kind of hope. So I told her, "Don't worry, it's just a dope and weapons case. I ain't killed nobody, so before you start freaking out, let's just see what happens." Even then I knew I was selling her a dream, but under the circumstances, I felt like it was the best thing to do. Because this was the thing, Vicky had lupus, and for those of you who don't know what lupus is a chronic autoimmune disease that attacks the body's major organs and causes major inflammation throughout the body. It's not only extremely painful, but it's also a terminal illness and they don't have a cure for it. Unfortunately for her, she had the worst form of it, systemic lupus erythematosus, and it attacked her heart and her heart's valves. Since the time she was 18, she had 4 open heart surgeries. They had to keep replacing her heart valves that kept degenerating. And for lupus, stress is the #1 killer. Stress speeds up the degeneration process and triggers severe inflammation. So from the gate, I was trying to keep her pacified by downplaying my circumstances and by just trying to lead her to believe that I was going to come out of this okay. When I first met her, she was a very independent woman. She did everything for herself and she depended on no one. But as time went on, I took her independence away and began doing everything for her. I took her to all her appointments, I made sure she took all her medications, and I did all the other things that you do for someone like that that's suffering from a terminal illness. The last thing I told her before they whisked me off to transport me to the county jail is not to worry, that she'd be okay, because I still had about 30,000 out there on the streets that I was going to scrape up for her. While we were still sitting there on the couch, a white officer walked in and said, "What's up, Boxer? I'll holler at you in a minute." I had never seen this dude before, but as he was walking through the house, looking at what kind of contraband they found. I strained my ears to listen to who this cat was and what kind of role he played in this. Come to find out, his name was Dan Livingston. He was from Campbell PD, but he was working with this other agency, SEC-SET, that was apparently in charge of this investigation, and it was his case. As I listened to him make his rounds, I kept hearing him say, "That's 25 to life. That's another 25 to life. That's a gang enhancement," etc., etc. When he finally came out to the living room, he said, "Hey, Boxer, let me holler at you real quick." He led me out to my back porch and he said, "Look, man, this ain't personal. I don't have a hard-on for the NF, but I'm working a case. I've been investigating you. I know you're running a regiment out here. I know Pony's your second in command. I know you own a limousine company, and I know everyone who's working under you." I just stood there listening to him. Then he said, "I know you're a 3-striker. We're raiding 12 other houses in conjunction with this investigation right now. Game's over. You're never gonna see the outside of a prison again." I said, "It's all good. Just let my girl go. I'll take responsibility for everything you guys found here. Just let her go. She don't know shit about anything I'm involved in." He said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. If you're willing to step up like a man and take a hit for everything we found, I'll cut your girl loose. But tell me now, did we find everything? Because if you don't tell me now and we have to find it ourselves, she's gonna get charged with you too." They had pretty much found everything. I was really kind of dry when they hit me because there were times when I'd have up to 15 to 20 pounds of crystal at the house, but I only had about a pound and had sold everything the night before. I said, "There's another pound in the garage, but you guys got everything else." And that was the truth. I showed them where they missed that other pound, and then we went back out to my patio. He said, "Where's Pony at?" We hit his parole address, but he slipped out the back door on us. I told him, "I'm not talking about anyone else. I buried myself and I owned up to my own shit, but I'm not dropping no names. I'm not talking about anyone else." He said, "Okay, I respect that, but if I were you, I'd tell him to turn himself in, because if we have to find him, things are going to be worse for him." That was it. That was the extent of my initial interaction with him, and although he kept his word later that night by letting Vicky go, I honestly thought he was going to okie doke me. I had no confidence in anything he told me, but at that point, he was holding all the cards and I didn't have no other choice but to take his word for it. From there, I was transported to Campbell PD, where I provided them with a formal statement taking ownership of all the contraband they found in my house. So when I got to the substation in Campbell, I was put in one of their small holding cells and was told to just wait, that someone would be talking to me at some point. When I first got there, I thought I was the only one there, as I didn't see anyone else in any of the other holding tanks. But one of my close associates, a guy named John Santa Ana, who I used as a safe house to hold a lot of my guns, was actually in a cell that wasn't visible from where I was being held. I'd only find out that he was there later after they started conducting interviews and they walked in past my window. Approximately 30 minutes after I got there, they walked my girl in and put her in the tank directly across from where I was at. As soon as the officer unhandcuffed her and walked away, I asked her why they brought her there, if they had promised to let her go. For a brief minute, I felt like a fool. I felt like Livingston had played me, but she said they brought her there to interview her and that they had told her that they'd be releasing her from there. I was even more skeptical about them cutting her loose now, but all I could do was just wait it out and just hope that they'd honor their word. One of the things that I really wanted to reemphasize to Vicky was that I was going to get $25,000 to her that I had at another one of my close associates' houses, and that this money was going to help her pay her bills out there. I was at least trying to make sure she was going to be okay, since I was obviously going to be gone for a while. The money was being kept in a safe in his garage, and I had told her about the presence of this money before in the past, just in case anything ever happened to me. As I was telling her about it, I motioned my hands as if I was simulating the shape of a box, since she couldn't hear me. The box motion I was making was supposed to be a reference to the safe I was storing it in, but not even 5 seconds after telling her this, my worst nightmare had literally just played out in front of me. The door swung open and in walked an officer escorting Roger Carranza, the close associate who was safekeeping the safe for me. There went that idea. I had introduced Vicky to Roger in the past just in case she ever needed to retrieve the money herself. As soon as she seen him walk in, she also understood what was going on. My plans and my resources for helping her were getting picked off and were rapidly disappearing. Trying my best not to look discouraged, I went to plan C or plan D or plan F. I waved that off, telling her not to worry about it because I still had about 15 to 20,000 on the streets that I tried to get to her. At that point, they began pulling us all in one at a time to start their interviews. John Santa Ana was the first one to be called in. He's the one who allowed me to keep my entire gun cache stashed in his basement. He was in and out in about 15 minutes. They called Roger in next. He came out about 20 minutes later. What happened next is something that I still remember like it happened yesterday. As soon as Roger came out, the officer escorted him back to the same holding cell and walked away. As soon as the officer disappeared out of sight, Roger looked at me dead in my eyes and made a zipping motion across his lips. I understood exactly what he was trying to communicate. He was basically telling me that he had held his mud and that he didn't snitch on anybody. At the time, I had no reason to believe otherwise, and I genuinely believed him. This was something I respected Roger for. It was uplifting and inspiring knowing that he was being a stand-up guy. And I had an overwhelming feeling of admiration and satisfaction knowing that the people that I had surrounded myself with were holding their mud. That my circle was staying strong. That none of them were turning on me. At least that's what I thought. Unbeknownst to me, at the time, Roger had already spilled his guts at his house as soon as the SWAT team advanced on him and arrested him. All the police reports that documented the raids and these initial interviews would all come out within weeks, so it was known pretty early in the game that Roger was burnt up. I was the last one to be called in by the officer who was conducting the interviews. The officer doing the interviews was a big Samoan dude with a long braided ponytail, Loy Philo. As soon as I seen him, I thought to myself, this cat looks like a lot of the Samoan cats in the city, the ones called the SOS's, Sons of Samoa. This particular officer, whose name was Loy Philo, knew he was a big dude, and I could tell that he was probably used to intimidating people because of his size. That's just the impression he gave me. But I wasn't in the mood to play this game with this dude, and I just wasn't the type of dude that scares easily either. To top it off, I was having a bad day. I was on my way to jail. I was almost positive I was going to be fighting a life case, and I just wasn't in the mood for his bullshit. When he started the interview, he made a futile attempt at asking me questions about other people, and he asked me things that had nothing to do with the search at my house. If I recall what he asked correctly, I believe he asked something to the effect of where Pony was and how they could locate him. At that point, I told him, look, don't try asking me anything about anyone else other than the contraband that you guys found in my house. I'm not in the mood to play games. I already told Livingston I copped all the dope you guys found in my house, but I'm not talking about anything else outside of that. That was it. He took my statement and I was escorted back out. After we finished with my interview, I was allowed to say a quick goodbye to Vicky. I was then walked outside and then I was shipped off to the county jail. CHP transported me from my house to Campbell PD, but when I was transported from Campbell PD to the county jail, I was taken by 5 agents from the DOJ in a Suburban. Later on, I would find out that one of them was a former gang cop from Watsonville named Mike Walker. He would later get caught up for shooting a guy in the back. The victim was allegedly believed to be a known gang member named David Locon Gonzalez from San Jose, but he misidentified him and shot him while he was running. Walker was actually charged with killing this guy. The case was all over the media at that time. He was actually acquitted after a messy trial, but this killed his career and he either retired or was let go. But while Walker and these other agents from the Department of Justice were driving me to the Santa Clara County Jail, they tried their best to proposition me with the idea of cooperating. They said, "Boxer, you should consider helping yourself. We could move you out to another state. We could give you a new identity. We could give you a fresh start at a new life, blah, blah, blah." They shot their best pitch, but I just told them that I wasn't interested, that I couldn't see myself going out like that, and that burying myself was as far as I was willing to go. Walker even tried to give me his card just in case I ever changed my mind, but I refused to take it and just told him there was no reason for me to take it. While being transported to the main jail, I sat there quietly thinking as a lot of things started going through my mind. I knew I was in a lot of trouble, but I don't think the full extent of my situation had completely sunk in yet. When I finally rolled up to the Santa Clara County Jail, I was whisked through the front doors and walked into the main booking area by this entourage of agents as if I was some type of dirty trophy that they were proudly showing off. At least that's how I felt. Mike Walker and these other 4 agents literally stayed there with me and walked me through the entire intake process. After I was dressed out and put in a double red pants, red top, they even walked me into the jail with the classification gang intel officers all the way to the 2nd West, where they housed me in an observation cell. I'd end up staying in this observation cell for about a month, but 2 gang intel officers who were working intel at that time, Paul Cobb and another guy who they called Cowboy, were personally contacted by Agent Livingston. They were then told that he highly suggested that they curtail my communication with the other Northerners in the jail because I had too much influence. They actually tried to honor this during the first 3 weeks I was there. They did this by putting up one of them big white nurse partitions in front of my cell so that nobody would have any visuals on me, but eventually this failed. After 3 weeks, either someone forgot to put it up, someone got lazy and stopped caring, or they just got tired of fucking with it and realized it wasn't working. At any rate, I was able to establish an open line of communication with an area of the jail that housed a lot of the Northerners called the snake pits. This basically put me online with the whole jail. Now these next 3 weeks while I was housed in this observation cell was a critical part of what would transpire later. Things would happen that would cause irreparable damage that I just would not be able to overcome. So every time I called my family or my girl, all I'd ever get was tears and grief about the situation I was in. They knew I was in a lot of trouble and they basically seen the beginning of the end. Up until that point, my family had never spoke on any of my loyalties, ever before. They were aware of the type of lifestyle I was living and they knew about the things that I had obligated myself to, but it was something that they never openly spoke on. I always knew it was something that they didn't like, but they respected it, and nonetheless, that's just the way it's always been. But now that I was in the situation that I was in, they weren't pulling any punches or holding back on their true feelings. It was obvious that my mom was holding a lot of resentment based on the things she was saying. She asked me, "So are you really going to do this?" I said, "Do what?" She said, "Are you really going to spend the rest of your life in prison for a bunch of dudes that don't give a shit about you?" She said, "Do you have a private lawyer or a public pretender?" I said, "Right now I have a public pretender, but he's a good attorney." She just started laughing. I knew what she was getting at, and I knew she was right, but there was nothing I could say. She said, "Exactly, because they don't give a fuck about you. What happened to them retaining a private attorney for you? Those are supposed to be your so-called brothers. Don't you see what's happening? Now that you're locked up, they're just gonna move on to the next guy. You're no longer an asset to them anymore because you're no longer in a position to make them money. Now you're just a liability, just another hungry mouth to feed." One thing I've got to say about my mom was that she was straight-laced. She was from the hood, so she was street smart and knew how the game was played. But even though I knew she was spot on about a lot of the things she was telling me, it wasn't a conversation I wanted to have. I was still loyal to the NF, and this was something that was still burning strong in my heart. It's not like she was bringing these things to the surface for the first time. I knew how the game worked, as I had seen it play out with dozens of other C's who had been in the same situation before me. I seen and felt a lot of the trepidation and malfeasance as far back as the mid-90s, when the organization began to lose sight of some of its most fundamental objectives. So she wasn't telling me nothing I didn't already know. She was just repeating it. She was relentless. She continued to tell me how I owed it to her, my real family, and my wife who was dying and who needed me. She reminded me that they were the ones who had never turned their backs on me, and how they were the ones who had always been there for me during all my bids whenever I went back to prison. Initially, I just let her rant and blow off her steam because I knew it was something she needed to get out. But she wouldn't stop. She went as far as taking the position that if this is what I was going to choose to do, then there wasn't any need for me to call there anymore. That my loyalty was with the NF, not them. During the second week that I was in this observation cell, Vicky ended up having a bad lupus flare-up and she wound up in the hospital. I could already tell that she was stressed. I could already tell that the stress she was under was causing her to get sicker, and it was a progression that happened fast. My mom took this opportunity to lay guilt trip after guilt trip on me. Most of the time I called home, it was just to connect with my loved ones and just to spend as much time with them as possible. To just take my mind out of the county jail. That's how I was looking at it, because I knew that once I was convicted and got shipped back to the Bay, that I probably never had the luxury of talking to them on the phone again. That my interaction with them at that time would then be relegated to just pen and paper. I was already resigning myself to the fact that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison, and I was okay with that. I fought life cases before, and in those situations, if you're not at peace with doing life in prison, then your head's always going to be in the wrong spot. But this time I was preparing myself for it. When Vicky got sick, my mom really started pressing me about what I was going to do, about what choices I was willing to make for myself. All that kept coming out of her mouth was that I needed to cooperate, that I needed to help myself and do whatever I had to do in order to make it back home to my wife. She even began to tell her, if you don't do it, or if he's not at least willing to consider it, then we don't mean shit to him and he never loved you. At the time, I knew that she was just being a mother telling her son what any mother probably would have told their son that knew he was in a bad predicament. But she was actually doing more harm than good. Eventually, I just started telling her all the things that I knew she wanted to hear. When she started going on her rants and started going down that road, I just started telling her, yeah, I'll do it. Whatever I need to do in order to get back home to you guys, I'll do it. If I have to cooperate, then that's what I'll do. If I have to take the organization down to get back home, then that's what I'll do. Even though I sounded like a degenerate saying these things, it actually kept her pacified, and the conversations about it became less frequent. The only one who understood my plight was my stepfather. Despite the fact that I began telling my mom these things, and despite the fact that she believed it, whenever she would hand him the phone, I would tell him, Pops, between you and me, you know I can't do what Mom and Vicky are trying to encourage me to do, right? You know you taught me better than that. This is something that they'll never understand. Even though he never got clicked up or got involved in that lifestyle himself, he always told me he understood and respected my position. No matter what I decided to do, he said he'd support me and understand. He said that in time, they'll eventually learn to as well. I know some of you can relate to the complexities that come along with our families not understanding the lifestyle that some of us choose to lead. The lifestyle, our choices, the politics are something they'll never understand. Nor should we expect them to either. Now, you guys need to understand that these conversations took place during the first 3 weeks after I touched down in the county jail. At this point, I think I barely even made my first court appearance in court for arraignment. In total, I believe there was probably about 10 phone calls collectively that contained conversations with regard to these degenerate discussions. There was only 10 because at some point I told my mom to stop talking about it. I told her that the phones were being recorded and that furthermore, talking like this could get me in a wreck. There's no way I possibly could have known it at the time, but the damage was already done. But I'll tell you what made me come to my senses and what led me to get my bearings back under me. One day when I was in my cell, one of the floor officers came to my cell and told me to get ready because I had an attorney interview. I figured it was probably my new public pretender because I had never even met him yet. 10 minutes later, the floor officer comes back, chains me up, and escorts me over to 2nd West to one of the attorney visiting rooms. When I walk in, I noticed it was Livingston and his partner, TJ Lewis. Before I could say anything, Livingston says, I just wanted to let you know that there was $600 in Vicky's wallet that we took into evidence, but the money was never documented on our seizure sheets. So we're gonna release that back to her. I said, yeah, that's her money. That's not dope money. I was making this clear because the day they searched my house, they took the $25,000 I had counted out on my desk, They took another $4,000 or $5,000 that I had in different parts of the house, and then they took another $2,000 that I had in the pocket of the basketball shorts I was wearing. They didn't leave me with a dime. I thought I was at least going to be able to make that first canteen draw to buy some honey buns, but hell nah. They stripped me for every penny I had. Anyways, I was sure that Livingston and his partner didn't come all the way up to the jail just to tell me this, so I waited to hear what else he had to say next. He said, "So we've been monitoring your phone calls and it sounds like you're considering helping yourself." I couldn't believe it. I mean, I always knew that the phones were monitored. They are in every jail or prison, but it still caught me off guard. This is something I wanted to quickly dispel because despite what I was telling my family, it couldn't be any further from the truth. I said, "Nah, I'm not considering nothing like that. I have my reasons for telling my family what I've been telling them, but I'm not interested in nothing like that." Livingston said, "Well, if you change your mind, you might want to do it soon because the window of opportunity is closing fast." After this brief exchange, I was escorted back to my cell. Now, for those of you who have read my book, I'm sure you know I'm skipping over a lot of stuff because there's just no way I can include everything in this narrative that I included in my book. I'm trying to condense most of the trivial events, and I'm sticking to the critical parts of this so as to keep the important parts of this in perspective. So I stayed in the observation cell for a good solid month before I was finally moved to an area of the jail they called Area 51. This was more formally known as ADSEG. It was located in the old jail on 2nd West, adjacent to the snake pits. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't have even seen it because all there was to identify it was a solid steel door with a small red play card type of sign on it that said administrative segregation. I already knew who was housed back there, and this is where I was trying to get housed at since I had gotten to the jail. Because prior to getting caught up, there was an NR member by the name of Joseph Otomi Abeda who used to call me from the county jail, and this is where he was housed at. I had known Otomi from doing time with him in Pelican Bay, and I had actually appointed him to be the RC for the entire county jail when I was on the streets. I basically had him overseeing the jail through me. I'm gonna keep it real. Getting on a tier and being back around the fellas was like a breath of fresh air. I didn't mind being in the observation cell by myself, and I was used to doing time like that. But there was too much going on at that time, and I needed to find out what was going on with some of the others who had also gotten arrested with me that same day. Besides Otomi, NF member Tomas Chopo McIntosh from Watsonville and NR member Mario Silent Arias from San Jose were also housed back there. Area 51 consisted of a small enclosed tier with 4 single-man cells and a shower. You had to go through 2 doors to get back there, so we were literally in a dungeon, buried. The floor officers barely came back there, so if you had a medical emergency, there's a good chance you died before anyone responded. Besides that, they had a TV back there on a roll cart that was positioned directly in the middle of the tier. The phone was also on a roll cart that could be pushed up and down the tier whenever someone wanted to use it. When I made my first court appearance, I didn't have any co-defendants. I was on a criminal complaint by myself. They consolidated cases over the course of time. The first 3 to be consolidated with me were John Santa Ana, Roger Carranza, and Jose Green Eyes Perez. As people slowly got arrested over the course of the next 2 years, they just continued to add them in as they got arrested. And most of them got added in as a result of their own indiscretions. They either had my contact information written somewhere or they got arrested with some type of physical evidence that linked them to me. And at that time, everyone in the jail knew that I was extremely hot and that my case was a high-profile case. So, getting consolidated with me at that time was commensurate to a death sentence. You knew that you were bound to get slaughtered just by the mere fact that you were associated with me. People were dreading it because they knew these cops weren't playing and that anybody who stood next to me in that courtroom were going to be looked at with the same kind of disparagement as me. Despite the fact that this was the first time I had come into contact with any of these brothers that were back there in Area 51 with me, they all knew I was in the jail the same day I got there. And even though they knew quite a bit about all the raids and everything that happened from people they had talked to, they didn't know all the details and how bad it really was. That first day I moved back there, we probably spent about 5 or 6 hours talking about everything that happened. I told them all the details, including the fact that the DOJ agents that transported me to the county jail tried to proposition me, and that Livingston had tried to flip me twice, once at my house and once when they pulled me out at the jail. One of the first things we were trying to figure out, based on everything that happened, was who it might have been that told on all of us. All the search warrant said was that it was an individual who had provided information to law enforcement on at least 4 or 5 other occasions, and that the information led to the arrest of drug dealers who possessed at least a pound or more. It also said that this confidential informant was familiar with Norteño street gangs and how they operated. That don't say shit. Then it said that the credibility and veracity of this informant's information was also proven to be credible. The one person that just kept popping back into my mind was Latigo from Gilroy. Think about it. Latigo had a motive to get rid of me. He knew his deadline was coming up, and he knew I was serious about taking his shit. Also, the fact that he came by that night was something that was suspicious in itself. Not only because it came out of nowhere, but also because this was the first time he had ever come by my house, and I just got a bad vibe from him. The other thing is this. The cops that bashed in my door originally got the search warrant signed on June 4th, 2004, a week before they decided to execute the search. So they waited a whole week until June 11th, 2004. This was the same night Latigo came by. And if they were going to raid my house, don't you think they'd want to make sure that there was dope in place inside the house instead of taking a chance of catching me dry? Wouldn't the best way to do that be by sending someone in to confirm it? Someone to put eyes on it? I still can't say definitively who snitched on me, but everything about it was suspicious, and it always bothered me. On top of that, the other thing is this. When all the police reports came in, and there was almost 1,000 pages, the 30+ pages that involved Latigo and the parole search that they conducted on his residence were all redacted except for 3 pages. For those of you that don't know what redacted means, it means that the DA blackened out the police reports because they contained sensitive information that they didn't want other people to see. Usually because it either puts someone in danger or it exposes the identity or whereabouts of an informant. Again, I have nothing in black and white to prove it, but it's not a complicated puzzle to put together. Tell me what you guys think. So Chopo and Silent were the only other 2 back there in Area 51 with me and Natomi for about 3 weeks. They were both waiting to go back to the feds. Chopo on a violation and Silent was getting deported. By the time they had departed, Arthur Pony Hernandez and Martin Sykes Martinez had both been arrested and were housed somewhere on the 4th floor. As soon as Chopo and Silent left, they moved Pony and Sykes down to Area 51 with me and Natomi. Pony was my second in command, and Sykes was one of the more influential members of my regiment that I had working with me. Sykes and his little bro, Angel Young Buck Martinez, both from Goshen, were a package deal. If you guys remember the episode I did on the Impala shootout, Young Buck, aka Angel, was the one who went back in the apartment for me after the shootout and got all the guns and the dope before the cops got there. In fact, I recruited his older brother Sykes as a C right before we all got raided. Now I want you guys to pay close attention to some of these details that I'm giving you, because it would not only add to my indignation with regards to all these guys who had made statements against me, but later you'll also understand why I felt snubbed and insulted the way I did. When Pony was arrested and brought to the jail, he agreed to be interviewed by Agent Livingston, the Department of Justice Commander Bob Messer, and 2 other agents from SEC-SET, the agency who was in charge of the investigation. He told the rest of us about this interview, but he conveniently left out the details. Why? What was he hiding? Just the fact that he agreed to this interview the way he did was suspicious to me, but nonetheless, I still gave him the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't like they just showed up at the jail and he didn't know they were there. This was the same day he got picked up, and they did it in the basement of the jail in a room called the ODR, Officer Dining Room. This room was known for and had a history of being used to burn people up in these kinds of secret squirrel backdoor meetings. And Pony walked into the jail with them and went straight back to this room to give them this interview. None of these police reports would come out until later, about a year after we were all there. But as soon as I seen the reports detailing Pony's interview, I was pissed. This is the gist of it. They asked Pony several questions, all of which were about me and some of the things I was doing out there. They asked him how he knew me. He told them that I was a friend that he'd met through a mutual friend. He told them that he just used to basically borrow large sums of money from me. They asked him how much money he borrowed and whether or not he had ever seen me with large sums of money. He told them that he had seen me with large sums of money on several occasions, but that he wasn't sure where I got it. Now let me tell you guys where I have a problem with this. Here I am in the county jail fighting the case under the specific charges of possession of narcotics for sale, participating in the criminal street gang, conspiracy, possession of money over $25,000 that was derived from narcotics proceeds, and multiple gang enhancements. So here I am charged with all these charges, and this guy is in there telling them that I was loaning him large sums of money, that he had seen me with large sums of money when I don't even have a legitimate job. I was basically living beyond my means. But what business does he have telling them this about me, let alone answering any questions about me? Since when is that okay? Isn't that snitching? Like I said, all these police reports, including the ones documenting the raids, all came out about a year after we were all in the county jail. We found out about Roger telling early in the game because classification put him in protective custody after they became aware of his statements. All his statements were about me and all the dope I was supplying everyone with. Even the reports detailing my conversations with Livingston and the interviews I gave at Campbell, where I stated that all the drugs they found at my house came out, and they clearly stated that I refused to cooperate or talk about anyone else. When I first moved back to Area 51, I basically took the jail over within the first week of getting there. I was also overseeing the streets as well due to the fact that there were no other NF members out there. Othomi had been fighting a 3 strikes case for about 2 years and had just basically beat it. When I got back there, he was literally about 3 weeks from getting sentenced to 3 years. After I got settled in back there, I started trying to figure out a way to get all the money I had on the streets from everybody I had fronted. But everybody that I had trusted was either MIA or were locked up. During one of my phone calls, Othomi overheard me on the phone and offered to help me. He said, "Hey Box, I got a primo out there that ain't doing shit right now. If you want, I can hit him up and tell him to help get some of that money off the streets for you." I told Othomi, "Yeah bro, if you guys want to help get it, tell him I'll split it with you guys." I gave him all the names and contact info of everybody that owed me money out there, and I basically let Othomi and his primo take care of it from there. I assumed that they had a discreet way of communicating and that they had their codes established, but later I'd find out that these two cats were sloppy, openly saying names, places, and money amounts like it was nobody's business. Shit, they might as well have just wrote out the names, addresses, and ledgers for the cops. Othomi and his primo started with trying to get one of the biggest debts that was owed to me out there, $5,000 by one of my regiment members, a cat named Jesse Conejo Rodriguez. During the first week, they made a lot of progress, and Conejo was actually trying to get the money together. He dropped some off, and he had also dropped off a couple ounces of meth as a form of payment. Twist then took that money and was slowly passing it on to Vicky for me. But then they spooked him and told him that if he didn't have the rest of that money by the end of that week, that I was going to deem him no good. The cops that arrested me, Livingston and SEC-SCT, were monitoring the shit out of that phone and seized the opportunity to spook and flip Conejo. They approached him out on the streets and basically got in his head, telling him that I had already deemed him and that it didn't matter whether he got the money together or not. They told him, "Boxer's a bad dude. He has priors for having people whacked like this, so you might want to think about helping yourself. Otherwise, we're going to hit you with conspiracy and gang enhancements." Then they told him that he'd go down with everybody else if he didn't get on board. 4 or 5 days went by and Conejo had apparently disappeared. He stopped answering his phone, and then Othomi's primo disappeared. That same week, Athomi went to his sentencing and got sentenced to 3 years at his Romero hearing. When he came back from court that day, he sent me all his extra property, everything he wasn't going to take to prison with him. All his pencils, cups, books, magazines, canteen, etc., etc. After he couldn't get his primo on the phone, we started cracking jokes that maybe he got busted and that maybe that fool was right outside the door in the snake pits. We were joking, but there was also a level of seriousness and concern in this as well. It was a little unusual that Twist just stopped answering his phone the way he did. It wasn't until the next day that Athomi and Pony both went out to the sun deck and walked by the snake pits that they found out what happened. His primo, Frank Catfish Twist, was really in the pits, and when they walked by, he put his hand to his ear, a gesture simulating talking on the phone, and then he did another gesture of making a slicing motion across the front of his neck. The message was clear. Twist was there as a result of the phone calls, and that the phone was all bad. I couldn't believe it when Athomi came back from the yard and told me, but the first thing I asked him was how careful they were on the phone. He claimed that they were extra careful and had spoken in code, but later on I found out that this wasn't true. They were sloppy and they just spoke openly. That same night, I posted a big sign on our phone that said, "This phone is being monitored by the FBI, the punk-ass cops from SCCSCT, and gang intel." Later on, they would actually come on the tier with the camera, and they took pictures of that sign and tried to use it against us in our case. The following morning, real early, the floor officer came in and told Athomi he had court. He told the officer that he was done with court and asked what it was for. Of course, the officer dummied up. When I asked Athomi, he told me that it was probably for child custody, so he wasn't tripping. But that couldn't have been any further from the truth. When he came back from court later that afternoon, he looked sick. He had a look on his face like he had just sucked on a lemon. When the CO got off the tier, I said, "Athomi, what's going on, bro?" He told me that him and his primo both were being charged with conspiracy, possession of narcotics for sale, extortion, participating in a criminal street gang, and multiple gang enhancements. I felt bad, but I called over to Athomi and said, "Hey homie, I guess that means you're gonna want your stuff back then, huh?" I sent all his books, magazines, pencils, canteen right on back to him and said, "Fuck it, bro. I didn't want you to leave anyway." About a month later, it was about 5 a.m. in the morning when all of a sudden, about 20 or 30 COs ran into Area 51 and conducted a surprise search. They came in hella deep and tried to catch us slipping. They said, "Get up, don't touch nothing, don't get dressed, don't do nothing, just come out of your cells." When they cuffed us all up and walked us out in the Second West, the whole SCCSCT outside agency were all standing there in street clothes waiting to go in and search ourselves. While they were in there shaking us down, they put us all in separate attorney interview rooms until they were done. This was an actual search warrant that they were executing from the courts. While I was waiting to get escorted back to my cell, Livingston and the DOJ commander Bob Mercer came to my interview room I was in and opened the door. Mercer was a hard ass with a bad attitude, and from the minute we crossed paths, we didn't get along and we didn't care for each other. Mercer did all the talking. He said, "Boxer, you really need to start thinking about doing whatever you can to help yourself, because your window of opportunity is getting smaller and smaller." I said, "You guys are wasting your time. I thought my window of opportunity was about to close about a year ago. I already told you I'm not interested. Do what you gotta do." This fool had the audacity to act like he was getting upset. Then he practically threatened me and said, "Okay, Boxer, you want to play hardball? Something big's gonna come hit you right in the chest, and you're gonna get buried by an avalanche with all your little homeboys." I laughed and said, "What are you gonna do, Bob? Indict me? I'm already looking at life, so there's nothing else you guys can do to me." He shook his head, and then they both turned around and slammed the door. I'm just pointing this out. If it was ever about cooperating to help myself, or put myself in a better position time-wise, or to just avoid going to prison, I would have checked out right there. Or possibly way before this, early on when these guys propositioned me. If I would have, I probably wouldn't have gotten indicted. Well, I know I wouldn't have. And there's a chance that I could have gotten out sooner. But this just wasn't in the cards for me. I was firmly against it, and at that time I never even considered it. My heart was still with the familia, and I was still firmly footed in the commitment I had made years ago. People can say whatever they want about me, and they can label me to be whatever they want me to be. But the one thing they can't label me is a coward. Whether people believe this or not, it doesn't even matter. What's done is done, and it's not going to change anything. But I'm going to say it anyway. When I made a commitment to the Nuestra Familia back in 1994, I knew I was eventually going to spend the rest of my life in prison, or that I'd lose my life in the course of pushing the organization's advancement forward. This is something that Mikhail reiterated to me over and over when he was bringing me in. He told me, this is a hard life. It isn't for everyone. At some point, you're either going to spend the rest of your life in prison, or you're going to lose your life during the course of promoting the organization's forward progress. This was something I often thought about over the years as I continued to function within the familia. I had to. It's almost like I had to continue to rejuvenate and recondition my loyalty. Not because I was wavering or losing my resolve, but just because I didn't want to allow myself to lose sight of these fundamental beliefs, especially when I was seeing some of the subversion within the O that could discourage even some of the most resolute and stalwart believers. When we were escorted back into Area 51 and placed back in our cells, it was almost like we were moving back into new cells. They didn't leave anything behind. The only thing they left was a standard issue: 2 sheets, a blanket, a towel, a cup, a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a roll of toilet paper. That was it. They also left behind property sheets that inventoried everything that they had taken. All our property was sent to a private, impartial, independent mediator so that it could be searched for gang indicia and then returned to our attorneys. As soon as we were all back in our cells, I told the other 3 about the interaction I had with Livingston and Messer. It was becoming obvious that these guys were hell-bent on flipping me, but again, I was completely against it, and over time, I continued to get myself into deeper trouble. I don't think this is the path that someone who's thinking about cooperating would have taken, and this is common sense. But we were all united in this path together. Our mindset back there amongst each other, amongst the 4 of us, was that we were all getting deeper and deeper into trouble, but at the same time, we didn't give a fuck. We stopped caring. The possibility of any of us ever getting out again began to look like it was getting further and further out of reach. And when you come to terms with resolving yourself to spending the rest of your life in prison, and you reach a point to where you've honestly become at peace with it, you stop caring about getting into trouble or catching more cases. Here's an example. Throughout all the years that I've done time, I've always been the kind of dude to show a certain level of respect to the administration or to the officers that I would encounter in whatever jail or prison I was doing time at. I'm old school. Their house, they maintain most of the control, but at the same time, if I ever ran into an officer that tried throwing his weight around, I wouldn't hesitate to assault or stab them either. I would always avoid it, but if there was an officer that made it personal and it was obvious he was going out of his way to fuck with me, then I didn't have a problem giving him the only thing some officers like him understand: a reaction. Sometimes in prison, the only thing people seem to understand is violence. Not just with inmates either, sometimes with the COs as well. Sometimes this is the only thing that shakes them back into reality and stops them from thinking that they can just treat inmates however they choose to treat them. Ironically, there just so happened to be an officer named Kelter that was working on our tier one day, who had this kind of cynical attitude and who insisted on trying to be a tough guy. I don't know if he felt like he had to put on a front since he was working on what was probably considered the highest maximum security tier in the jail, or if he just wanted to play tough guy. Whatever the case was, his demeanor was something we all noticed as soon as he came on the tier. That same day, I had a visit. One of the other floor officers escorted me to my visit, but when it came time to take me back up, Kelter was the one who came down to the visiting room to escort me back. By this time, I had already been in the jail for a little over 2 years, so I knew the routine like the back of my hand. During escort, I knew where to walk, I knew when to face the wall if we got into the elevator, I knew where not to walk, etc., etc. But he was the type of officer who enjoyed asserting his authority. He had to be in control. The whole time he was escorting me, he was telling me, walk here, step over there, face this wall, face that wall, etc., etc. At first, I didn't say anything. I just let him do his thing, and I let him feel like he was in charge. But when we got to Area 51 and he continued to do it, I eventually got tired of it and told him, look man, I know the fucking routine. You ain't walking no fucking dog. But this just made him poke his chest out even more. When we got to my cell, he keyed my door and then said, let me take your shackles off. So I stepped into the doorway of my cell and I kicked up one of my feet behind me so that he could take off my shackles. This is the way 90% of the COs used to do it. So that's the way I did it. But this guy said, no, come out here and get on the wall. I snapped back, fuck all that, man. If you're gonna take the shackles off, take them off. Otherwise, you ain't getting them back. At that point, he tried to grab my waist change from the back and he tried to pull me out of the cell to guide me to the wall. As soon as he did that, I spun around towards him, grabbed 2 handfuls of his jumpsuit by his belt and lifted him up the best way I could. With my chains on, I basically had to arch my back backwards, but I was able to get him off the ground. My intentions were to try to body slam him, but the waist chains limited my range and I couldn't get the momentum to do it. Instead, we both barreled into the TV so hard that the electrical cord from the TV snapped and the TV along with the stand it was sitting on went crashing to the floor. There went our damn TV for the next 2 months. Anyways, we both ended up going down to the floor as well. I held on to his jumpsuit for as long as I could, but this cat hit the alarm, so I knew it would only be a matter of another minute or two before the whole tier was overrun by green suits. As we were literally both laying there side by side, this fool kept telling me to let go of his uniform, but I just held on. I knew if I let go, he was going to start trying to hit me. Within another minute or two, the whole tier was flooded with COs. As soon as they were within feet of dogpiling me, I let go and started throwing whatever I could. Kicks, punches, elbows, knees, headbutts, not at anyone in particular, but rather at whoever was within reach or who was within striking range. Some of the officers who I would label as being a little more aggressive or who had a mutual dislike for me began to punch and kick back at me, but my adrenaline was pumping so much that I didn't even feel it. They punched like girls anyway. Just then, out of my peripheral, I seen something out the side of my eye that I knew was about to take this incident to another level. When I looked over towards the Thomi's door, I seen him putting a pencil on the end of his channel changer, and I already knew what he was doing. A channel changer is constructed by rolling up several pieces of paper so that we could reach the buttons on the TV with an extension. It kinda looked like a fishing pole. He was gonna use it to spear one of the COs who I was fighting with. I loved him for that, and the Thomies never hesitated to ride when it was time. I also knew he was just trying to help me, and I probably would have done the same thing if I would have seen a bunch of COs jumping on a homeboy myself, but this was definitely going to be another one of the many cases that we'd end up picking up. Then I seen him stick it out, take aim, and pop! He hit an officer in the back of the head. The officer jumped up, turned to look at a Thomie and said, "Did you really fucking just do that?" Luckily, he was a CO that me and Thomie both knew and were cool with, because when hot heads would eventually cool down and tempers would later subside, he understood why Thomie did it and chose not to pursue criminal charges. He caught a break on that one. It ended up being a freebie. Anyways, after they scooped me up off the floor, they bent me forward, pulled my arms up high above my back, and began to walk me off the tier backwards. They tried to pick me up like a suitcase, but I was too damn heavy. As they were walking me backwards, I turned towards the Thomie's window one last time, shot him a quick smile, and then seen him shoot me back a quick peace sign. That was something we both laugh about later. I'd end up fighting with the COs on 3 other occasions over the next 7 years, and they all pretty much ended in similar fashion. I take a quick elevator ride to the basement, and they throw me in one of their padded ice boxes for the next 3 or 4 hours. And while they had me smashed into one of the corners of the elevator, they always tried to crank my wrists until they broke. I think they were just trying to see if they could get me to start wailing like a bitch. But of course, it would never work. Because for one, I have some big ass thick wrists. And for two, they could just never get a good grip on them. I get so mad that I tell them, go ahead, break them. You're not gonna get me to yell like a bitch, and then I tell them, come on, I'll fucking help you break them. I turn one way while they were trying to crank them the other way. About 4 or 5 hours of being locked in one of their ice boxes, they eventually escorted me back to my cell. Over the next 6 months, by then, they had basically arrested everyone that was either a part of my regiment or those who were considered close associates. They had them spread out all over different parts of the jail, but everyone knew that Area 51 was where they were keeping me and some of the others who were considered to be part of my leadership. My regiment was the first of many to get indicted, but before they started dropping the hammer on some of the other regiments, we were all considered to be high profile within the jail. At one point, I believe it was actually before they moved Sykes down to Area 51 with me and Athomi, they moved Athomi's primo Twist down there with us. Twist had never really done time before and really didn't belong down there with us, but he only stayed there for about 5 or 6 months before he was moved out and Sykes was moved in. But during the time he was there, something else happened that would continue to add to my list of condemnation. One day, both Twist and Athomi were called out for attorney interviews as their lawyers came up together. Nothing suspicious about that. About an hour later, they both came back in carrying a stack of police reports, and I could tell by the look on Athomi's face that something was wrong. I knew him well enough to read him like a book. At that time, I had the phone in front of my cell, and my tray slot was open. On the back of the phone, the actual apparatus that encased the phone, there was a mirror that was affixed to it. We couldn't really use it because we never came out on the tier, but we knew it was there, and sometimes we turned the phone around and used it to look at something that we were trying to show each other. Or we'd use it to look down the tier. The look of concern on Athomi's face bothered me, so I spun the phone around so I could use the mirror to see in his cell. When I got a visual, he had one foot up on his bunk and he was reading the police reports. He looked like he was in deep thought. I said, "What's up, O?" He said, "This fucking cop is lying motherfucker, B." I said, "Why? What's wrong?" He said, "B, he's trying to say my primo made all kinds of statements. It's bullshit, bro. I know my primo and he don't get on like that." Twist even chimed in and said, "Yeah, bro, he's lying. I never said any of that shit." I like Twist, but he was kind of like a square, and I just wasn't surprised to hear this. Now, I was getting upset because, for one, everything they were saying sounded like a bunch of bullshit, and I knew better. It sounded like Athomi was trying to protect them, and now I was worried about what the statements were about and who it implicated. It's an uphill battle claiming that a cop that documents your statements are fabricated. Where I'm from, police reports are golden. Black and white speaks for itself, and they're not debatable. I wasn't so much concerned about Twist telling on me. I was already buried and didn't give a fuck about that. I was more concerned about the possibility of him implicating my girl and involving her. Here I was burying myself to get her out of trouble, and just the thought of someone else coming along and sabotaging that was almost too much to bear. That would have meant that I would have gave them a 25 life confession for nothing. I asked Athomi, "What's he saying Twist said, bro?"
Hey, thanks for listening, guys. And as always, tune in tomorrow for part 2.